I'm Tim Windsor from BlackBerry Developer Relations. This video will be an introduction for anyone who wants to get involved in the BlackBerry open source community. So here's what's on the agenda. We'll cover some background on what exactly open source is, what GitHub is and the role it plays, and what the contributor agreement is all about. With all that out of the way, we'll look at the basics of using Git with open source development, discussing things like working with different repositories, doing pushes and pulls, branching, and submitting pull requests. It's by no means intended to make you an expert, so it won't be too in-depth, but it should get you over the initial bumps in the Git learning curve. We'll finish up with a review of what you'll need to do in order to get your code pulled into the main repositories, and how to get started on your first contributions. First, what is open source? Under most jurisdictions, creative works automatically assign copyright to the author. Open source, Creative Commons, and other open licenses use copyright law to open the use of creative works within the copyright law framework. So open source is both open code and an open license. There are very many licenses out there with a wide range of requirements. Our preference is for Apache 2.0, which has fairly minimal requirements for use and doesn't force a lot of restrictions on developers using it. Some of our code will be released under other licenses, or may include third-party resources released under licenses like Creative Commons. You may see MIT frequently, as it's similar but even less restricting than Apache 2.0. The license that code is released under is critical for users of it, as some licenses like GPL version 3 are viral, meaning anything that builds on the code must use the same license. Apache 2.0 does not share this requirement. GitHub is where all of our sample code, both official and community contributed, is posted. GitHub uses and builds on top of the Git distributed version control system. Besides being a great showcase for projects that makes it very easy to access and contribute to open source, it adds quite a few features that make working with Git easier, and supports a social, distributed mode of development. GitHub.com/BlackBerry is where we post all of our code. We have 89 repositories up there that cover samples for many different development approaches, community samples, all of our WebWorks and WebKit source, and our ports for BlackBerry 10. So let's take a look at a sample project there. Note that within this project, there's a license file, and the README here displays a bunch of information about licensing. The fact that the sample is released under the Apache 2.0 license, and also includes third-party assets that are released under the CC0 or public domain license. It's important when working with open source to make sure that you understand what license the code you're using is released under. In order to submit anything substantial, beyond a few lines of code or documentation changes, you'll need to sign the contributor agreement. This is a standard form used by organizations doing open source development. It keeps the licensing and copyright of open source materials clear and makes sure that code contributions are okay to be accepted. You can get a copy of the agreement. It is a PDF file from blackberry.github.io/howtocontribute.html. There are separate forms for corporations and for individuals. Print out the form and fill it out, then email a copy to github@blackberry.com and include your GitHub username. If you'd like your Twitter or website displayed as well, you can include that. We list all the approved contributors on the blackberry.github.io site, and repository owners check it when new contributors submit pull requests. A quick note for those filling this out. you're signing up as an individual, don't fill out this corporation name line here. This is only to include your ICLA, your individual contributor agreement, as part of a corporation's agreement. Just leave that blank if you're an individual. Now let's get into our discussion on Git. As I said, we're not going to go too detailed here. There's quite a learning curve with Git, but it's really a very good tool. You can do a lot with some basic knowledge. I'm going to go through each of these 6 points in greater detail in the following slides and include demonstrations of each process. First, we'll talk about repositories, forking, cloning, and adding remotes. Then how branches work and how you can use them effectively. Followed by how to do pulls and pushes between repositories. And finally, how to actually get your code into the BlackBerry repositories with a pull request. So let's get started. I'll be using these classic cylinder diagrams to represent repositories. When you're working on a distributed development project through GitHub, you'll generally start with a repository that has code you want to use or that you want to change. Let's say that repository is the orange one here. If you want to work with that code, you will do a fork on GitHub. Fork is a GitHub term that pretty much means take a copy of the repository at its current state and put it in MySpace. Now, since you probably want to actually look at the code and mess around with it on your own computer, you make a clone of the fork. That puts a copy of the fork on your machine. Let's take a look at that. Let's say I wanted to do some work on gameplay. Once I'm looking at the repository on the BlackBerry space here, I can do a fork to my own area. So now I have a copy of gameplay within MySpace. Now if I want to work on this on my own computer, I'm going to clone it to my machine. There's a few options for that. You can use the clone feature. You can use the command line. But I'm going to use a tool that I've recently started using that I find very useful, called Tortoise Git. If you're interested, you can get that here. I definitely recommend it. So you'll see me using this throughout these demonstrations. So you'll get to know what it can do for you. But back to cloning. If I just copy this to my clipboard, and I'll go into where I keep my samples, and I can do git clone. It's already automatically going to pull that out of the clipboard for me, fill out my directory all as I normally would. So I just hit OK. And that will pull down the repository for me so that I can use it. So let's go back to the presentation. So now we've got 3 repositories, and all of them contain the same history of commits, but they don't actually rely on each other at all. Each one can be changed, cloned, or forked separately from the others. It's pretty powerful, but of course it's pretty great to be able to connect your repositories together. So when you cloned your fork to the local machine, it implicitly added what's called a remote to your local repository. This is a link between repositories, and it serves as a short form when we want to share commits between repositories. The default remote is called the origin, and it points back to the repository on your GitHub account. Incidentally, the fork process does something similar, so your fork knows where it originally came from. This origin link is good so that we can do some work on our local machine, and we can publish our commits on the origin easily. But what happens when the BlackBerry repo gets updated with some code that we want? we need another remote. So we want to add a remote that refers to the BlackBerry repository. That way we can pull in code updates from the BlackBerry repository and get them on our own computer. With Git, there's always plenty of other ways to do things, but this way is good practice to follow. By adding a remote to your local machine, where you do your work, you can pull in updates and make your code work with the new code before publishing up to your public fork. The command to add a remote is git remote add. You pass in the short form name that you want to use and the repository URL. The practice that I follow is to use the organization or owner's name as the short form. So let's see that happen. The easiest way is to go back to that original repository and copy the repo URL right here. So now we have our two remotes added to our repository. So now that we have our links set up, but before I actually talk about pulling and pushing commits between repositories, let's cover branching briefly. Branching in Git is wonderfully done, but if you're like me, you may have come from a source control system that made branches seem really daunting and best left to larger projects. Now with Git, branches are cheap to create, useful, easy to switch between, and they provide an excellent logical organization of your work. Every repository has a default master branch. You can do your work on this branch, but I'm going to suggest that you instead create a new branch for every issue or feature that you work on. The actual cost in time and effort to do so will be repaid many times over in efficiency and organization gains. For example, if you've decided to do some work on a feature or issue, you can switch your local repository over to a new branch based on the master branch, all in one operation with the checkout command. And if you've already started editing some files, it's fine, because those changes will not be erased by the checkout. Switching back is easy with the checkout command, so you can move between different features that you're working on whenever you need. Keeping your code organized becomes really valuable when we start sharing it between repositories. So let's take a look at how this works. In this example, I'm going to use a different repository. So if I go to repository, I can check out a new branch all in one operation. You can see the command that tortoise git is running in the background. So now I'm on that branch. And if I make changes here and want to switch back to the master, I can quickly do that. So you can move between different features that you're working on whenever you need. Keeping your code organized becomes really valuable when we start sharing it between repositories. So let's take a look at why. A couple slides ago, I mentioned the situation where you've got a fork of a BlackBerry repository and you've cloned it, but now there are new updates in the BlackBerry repo that you want to pick up. Since we set up the BlackBerry remote, we can do a pull from it. A pull is a Git operation that fetches all the new commits from a remote and merges them into the new current branch. It's really two commands in one, and quite useful. The pull command takes a remote name and the branch to pull from. Now, in case you might have been working on another machine and updated your own fork, you could follow up with a pull from your origin repository as well. Then, with your local master up to date, you can create a new branch based on it and code away. Nice thing about using Tortoise Git is that it does very nice diffs. So I can see everything that's been changed and actually open up and look at the individual line changes. So I've updated my local repository, but let's pull in any changes I may have done on the server. Okay, already up to date. Now when you're ready to publish your work, the command to do is a push. I recommend pushing from the feature branch you are on and letting Git create that feature branch on GitHub. It's very useful for the next step. This operation will push up all the commits on that branch and create it on the destination repository if necessary. You'll also want to do a push of the master branch in order to keep your fork up to date with commits you pulled in from the BlackBerry repo. So since we did see some updates come in from our pull from BlackBerry, let's do a push on the master branch first. So we're going to push from the local master branch to the remote master branch. In this case, our remote we're using is the origin. And now let's switch to that branch that we made. Make some changes, commit them, and send a push off. So just a simple, innocuous little commit. So we'll commit this on this feature branch. And we'll do a push. So in this case, we've got our feature branch listed here. There is no remote branch, but we want to choose the origin. That's where we're going to send it. So that's our GitHub fork where we're going to send it. Okay, let's go to GitHub and see what that looks like. So you know that GitHub has a very nice feature for working with branches. Since we recently pushed to this branch, it actually shows up the quick option to do a pull request or to look at what changes we did. So let's switch to that branch. You can also switch between branches using this drop down here. So the changes we made were in the ant build script folder. And then you'll see the line that we added in. So that's the basics of doing a push to your public fork. And note that we've done this on the feature branch, not on the master. If you look back here, that line's not there. So now for the final step. If you've pushed code up to your fork on a branch, as you saw, GitHub helpfully suggests that you might want to do a pull request from that branch back to the repository that you forked from. When you do a pull request, you can choose both the branches and the repositories that should be involved. Every repository has a default master branch. Some projects might have a next branch to collect commits for a time before officially declaring a new version release and merging next down into master. But plenty will just have master as the only real long-lasting branch. That's important when you go to submit a pull request. Make sure you choose the right destination according to what the repository owners are asking for. When you've chosen your branches, GitHub will show you a list of commits and changes that will be included. By organizing your code into feature branches and keeping your fork up to date, you ensure that a pull request is a nice, concise collection of commits that can be reviewed easily. So back on GitHub, so we do a pull request. So it notes that master is already up to date. So do I want to use a different branch? This would be pre-filled if we had clicked the link on the awesome feature branch. So GitHub figures out what's changed, and since there's only one commit, it pre-fills the description for us. And you can see a diff here of everything that actually changed. So one very important note about branches and pull requests. While a pull request is open, any commits that you push on that branch will become part of the request. This is another reason to separate code into feature branches. It also means that if you forgot to commit something, you don't need to close the pull request and open a new one. Just commit the change on the feature branch and push it to your fork. It will appear in the pull request, and this is the best way to work with those reviewing the commits. It makes pull requests into a dialogue between the contributors. Lastly, if your pull request is to fix one or more issues tracked on GitHub, just include that in the description box. Those issues will get a link to the pull request, so those who are looking for the fix can check out the code. So let's follow through. If I send this pull request, now because the administrator of BlackBerry has given me control of this particular repository, I can actually merge this request in. And so normally you wouldn't see this. You would just have the option to close or comment on it. And if I was to do another commit on this branch and push it up to my public repository without doing anything, those further commits would appear in this list here. And then the list of commits and the files changed would be updated automatically for as long as this pull request is open. And for example, if I wanted to link to an issue, I just have to include the issue number. And that can be added at any time in the comments here, just by putting in the number sign and the issue number. Now once all the commits on a branch are either accepted or the pull requests for them are closed, GitHub allows you to easily delete that branch. When you are contributing larger amounts of code, like full samples or new files, there are certain things that need to be included. As we saw earlier, each sample needs to have a license file with the licenses of all contained sources. If there was a notice file in the code that was included, it also needs to be retained. Each contribution needs a README file, which should follow the pattern of the others that are published in the repositories. They should include the license the code is released under, with a link to that license, credit, and any license links for third-party content or image assets, and the standard open source disclaimer. In addition, it's best to include information like what versions of software and devices it was tested on, how to build, and any particular details about using the code or API. All the things that make it easier for another developer to proceed with using that same code. And anything released under the Apache license needs to have the copyright notice in the source files listed at the top. Finally, we'll want to make sure that we're not creating conflicts or collaborating someone else's work. So make sure you've updated your branch when you submit a pull request, and that only the pertinent changes are included in that request. All right, now you're ready to dive in. If you're looking for a project to start with, take a look at the repositories that have code you found valuable. Look at the issues list on GitHub and see if there's something you could try to fix. Try something of manageable size so you can go through the whole process fairly quickly. Another way to get involved is by creating a sample or perhaps taking some code you wrote and making it into a sample that others could make use of. We've got community samples repositories for all types of applications, and those samples are very well appreciated. If you're interested in doing something bigger, then by all means, reach out to me. You can post an issue on GitHub, ping me on Twitter, or send me an email. I'll pretty much always have some ideas for projects that we could work on, or groups already collaborating on something where you could join in. Open source is all about working together for everyone's benefit, and we can do some amazing things together through collaboration. Thanks very much for watching. I hope this has inspired you to get involved in our open source community.